I want you to picture the air in 1892 Florida, so thick with humidity and secrets it felt hard to breathe, in the suffocating quiet of the swamplands where Spanish moss hangs like old men's beards. A little girl believed a terrible truth. She believed her grandfather, the man who held her hand, was not a man at all. He was a god, and the offerings he demanded were not prayers or hymns, but something far more terrifying, a perfectly pure bloodline. Now you have to understand, this wasn't just a strange family belief. This was a blueprint for a nightmare. Beneath the guise of southern piety, a family tree was being intentionally twisted, its branches pruned and grafted together in ways that defy nature itself. The love that should bind a family was replaced by a cold, terrifying doctrine. What happened in that isolated homestead was a deliberate, calculated horror, a secret so dark it has been poisoning the soil of history for over a century. If you're here with me now, it's because you're not afraid of the dark. Welcome, brave souls, to Shadow Stories, our shared space for confronting the truths that history tried to bury. So, the question isn't just if you have the courage to hear what happened, but if you're willing to join the search. If you are, subscribe now and comment with your city to add your pin to our global map of investigators. Let's uncover this together. Now, to truly grasp how this nightmare could take root, I want you to picture the world we're stepping into. This isn't the Florida of theme parks and sunny beaches. This is 1892 Florida, a place of raw, untamed beauty and profound, suffocating isolation. The Civil War is a fresh scar, and the era of Reconstruction has left the South in a state of turmoil and identity crisis. Roads are little more than muddy tracks carved through ancient cypress swamps, and the nearest town might be a day's ride away. Imagine the sounds. A constant, low-level hum of insects, the sudden splash of an alligator sliding into black water, the rustle of unseen things in the dense undergrowth. The air itself feels heavy, thick with the smell of wet earth, decaying leaves, and sweet-smelling jasmine, a perfume that can't quite mask the scent of stagnation. In communities like this, cut off from newspapers, telegraphs, and the steady march of progress, the law is a distant concept. The real authority is the land itself, and the men who claim to understand its secrets. Faith isn't just a Sunday affair, it's the central pillar of existence, the only framework for making sense of hardship, disease, and the profound loneliness of frontier life. This is the critical element you have to understand. This isolation creates a vacuum, and into that vacuum, any powerful, charismatic voice can pour its own reality. When a man declares himself a prophet, who is there to contradict him? When he says God speaks directly through him, who has a louder voice to say otherwise? The swamp itself becomes a fortress, protecting the community not from outsiders, but from outside ideas. It's a perfect incubator for a belief system to grow, mutate, and fester, far from the prying eyes of a world that would never, ever understand. At the very center of this web sits the grandfather, a man we'll call Silas. To his family and the few outsiders who ever encountered him, Silas was not a monster. Let's be real, the most effective villains rarely are at first glance. I want you to picture him, tall and wiry, with skin weathered like old leather from a lifetime under the Florida sun. His hands are calloused and strong from working the land, but his eyes are where the unsettling truth resides. They are a pale, piercing blue, and they hold a gaze that feels ancient, a gaze that seems to look straight through your flesh and into the secrets of your soul. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't need to. His words are delivered in a low, calm cadence, each one chosen with the precision of a surgeon. He speaks in scripture, but the verses he chooses are always the ones about purity, about bloodlines, about separating the chosen from the unclean. He has this unnerving ability to make you feel simultaneously safe and terrified. He is the protector, the patriarch, the sole conduit to the divine will that governs their lives. But there's a subtle darkness that clings to him. It's in the way he places a hand on a grandchild's head, a gesture that looks like a blessing but feels like a claim of ownership. It's in the way the family members fall silent the moment he enters a room, their eyes darting to him for unspoken cues. His primary antagonist, or rather his chief enabler, is his wife Martha. A woman so thoroughly broken by Silas's doctrine that her own will has been completely subsumed by his. She is the one who translates his divine pronouncements into the family's daily reality, her face a mask of stoic piety that conceals decades of silent complicity and perhaps a terror too deep to ever acknowledge. Together, they are the unshakable foundation of this twisted world. Every successful, long-running conspiracy needs a cover story, a simple, plausible narrative that deflects suspicion and satisfies casual curiosity. And the one Silas and his family crafted was a masterpiece of rural simplicity. To the outside world, they were nothing more than a deeply religious, self-sufficient family who simply wished to be left alone to live according to their unique interpretation of God's word. A bit eccentric perhaps, but harmless. If a census taker or a traveling preacher happened upon their homestead, they'd see a community hard at work. Men and boys tilling the fields, women mending clothes or tending to a communal kitchen, everything operating with a quiet, disciplined efficiency. They would explain their isolation as a religious imperative, a desire to shield their children from the sins and temptations of the modern world. Their rejection of outside medicine, a testament to their unwavering faith in God's power to heal. The fact that family members only married other family members. It was explained away as a sacred tradition, a way to preserve the sanctity of their blessed lineage and keep their community spiritually pure and untainted. They would speak of it with a kind of humble pride, as if it were a great sacrifice they were making for their faith. Let's be real. In the late 19th century, particularly in the deeply religious and sparsely populated South, this explanation was not only believable, it was almost admirable to some. It played on the American ideal of rugged individualism and religious freedom. It was a narrative that said, "We are different, but we are devout, and we are harmless." This cover story was their shield, an invisible wall that was, in many ways, more effective than the swamp that surrounded them. It allowed the horror to flourish in plain sight, disguised as piety. Behind that shield of piety lay the machinery of control, a sinister infrastructure designed to enforce Silas's will at every moment of every day. Their homestead wasn't just a collection of buildings, it was a purpose-built camp. I want you to picture this, a central longhouse where meals were taken in silence under Silas's watchful eye. Smaller, surrounding cabins for the individual family units, their proximity ensuring no conversation went unheard, no secret meeting could take place. But the true heart of this infrastructure was a small, windowless room in Silas's own cabin, a place the children called the genealogy room. This was his sanctuary and his laboratory. Inside, there were no religious icons. Instead, the walls were covered with vast, sprawling charts meticulously drawn by hand. They weren't family trees in the way we know them. They were more like breeding charts for livestock. Names were connected by lines with notations written in Silas's spidery script, detailing physical attributes, perceived spiritual purity, and any defects. This is where the pairings were decided. It wasn't about love or choice. It was a cold, calculated process based on Silas's twisted eugenic theories. The infrastructure was also social. Labor was assigned not by skill, but as a tool of control. Those who showed unwavering loyalty were given easier tasks. Those who showed even a hint of doubt were assigned back-breaking work in the most unforgiving parts of the swamp. Food, a scarce resource, was also weaponized. Extra portions for the obedient, meager rations for the questioning. This system created a suffocating environment of constant surveillance, competition, and fear, ensuring that the family policed itself, with every member becoming a reluctant warden in their own prison. Even with a strong cover story, oddities were bound to arise, unavoidable cracks in the facade that demanded explanation, and for every crack, Silas had a carefully prepared plaster of divine reasoning. Now you have to understand, the most devastating and visible consequence of their practices was the health of their children. As generations of close-kin marriage passed, the genetic toll became undeniable. Children were born with physical deformities, cleft palates, club feet, vacant eyes. Some had cognitive impairments, unable to learn or speak beyond the most basic level. To any outsider, this would be a horrifying red flag. But within the community, Silas spun it as a sign of their special status. These children, he would proclaim, were not damaged. They were holy innocents, or sacred scribes. Their physical forms were, he claimed, unburdened by worldly perfection, making them closer to God. Their silence was not an impairment but a holy vow. Their suffering was not a tragedy, but a testament to the family's purity, a burden they were chosen to bear. He twisted genetic catastrophe into a mark of divine favor. If a child was stillborn or died in infancy, it wasn't a medical crisis. It was because the soul was too pure for the mortal world and had been recalled to heaven. This perverse logic was disturbingly effective. It preempted grief and replaced it with a sense of solemn purpose. It transformed a source of potential shame and questioning into another pillar of their shared identity, another secret that bound them together against a world that could never comprehend their sacred mission. Let's be real, it was a form of psychological manipulation so profound that it convinced parents the sickness of their children was a blessing. No tyrant, no matter how charismatic, can maintain absolute control alone. They always need a lieutenant, a trusted enforcer who operates in their shadow. For Silas, this figure was his eldest son, a man named Caleb. Caleb was not like his father. He lacked Silas's magnetic charisma and his unnerving, quiet intensity. Instead, Caleb was a man forged in fear and desperate approval-seeking. Growing up as the firstborn son of a living God, his entire life had been a test, one he could never quite pass. He was a stern, physically imposing man, quick to anger and quicker to act on it. While Silas controlled the family's minds with theology, Caleb controlled their bodies with brute force and intimidation. He was the one who oversaw the work assignments, who enforced the punishments Silas decreed. If a teenager was caught hoarding a piece of fruit, it was Caleb who would deliver the public shaming. If a couple was suspected of meeting without permission, it was Caleb who would drag them before his father. But his role was more insidious than just being the muscle. He was the gatekeeper. He managed the limited interactions the family had with the outside world, ensuring that no one spoke out of turn, that the cover story was maintained with rigid discipline. He did this not out of a deep-seated belief in the doctrine, but out of a twisted mix of love and terror for his father. He was a man who knew on some level that the world they had built was wrong, but his own identity was so intertwined with his father's power that to question it would be to destroy himself. He was a prisoner who had been handed the keys to the other cells, and he guarded them with his life. When we talk about this story, it's easy to focus on Silas, the monstrous architect of it all, but we can't lose sight of who the real victims were. They were, first and foremost, the women and children born into this cage. I want you to picture the life of a young girl in this community. From the moment she is born, she is not an individual, she is a vessel, a future carrier of the sacred bloodline. Her worth is measured by her health, her obedience, and her potential to produce offspring that fit Silas's criteria. She has no say in her education, which is limited to domestic chores and memorizing the scripture that justifies her own subjugation. She has no say in who she will marry. Her partner is chosen for her from the charts in the genealogy room, often a cousin, an uncle, or a man decades her senior. Love is a foreign, dangerous concept. Her body is not her own. It belongs to the family, to the bloodline, to Silas. The children, especially those born with the inevitable genetic defects, are victims in a different but equally tragic way. They are living symbols of the family's purity, yet they are often hidden away, their care a burden, their lives a constant painful struggle. But let's be real, every single person under Silas's control, with the possible exception of Silas himself, was a victim. Even a collaborator like Caleb was trapped, his humanity corroded by the role he was forced to play. They were all caught in a web of psychological, spiritual, and physical abuse, their identities systematically dismantled and replaced with the singular, crushing purpose of serving one man's delusional fantasy. They were denied the fundamental human right to choose their own path, to love who they love, and to simply be themselves. For years, the family's isolation was nearly perfect, but the swamp, while a fortress, could not keep everyone out forever. The accidental witness in this story wasn't a lawman or a reporter, but someone far more mundane, a young botanist from the University of Florida named Arthur Vance. In the spring of 1892, Vance was on a solo expedition commissioned to catalogue rare orchids that were rumoured to grow deep within this particular stretch of swampland. He was a man of science, of logic and observation. He spent weeks camping, meticulously documenting flora, largely unaware of the small, isolated community nearby. One evening, searching for a specific night-blooming orchid near a freshwater spring, he stumbled too close to the homestead. He hid in the dense foliage, not wanting to disturb what he assumed was a simple farming family. But what he saw transfixed him. He saw Caleb dragging a young woman, no older than 16, by her arm. He saw the girl crying silently, her face a mask of pure terror. He saw Silas emerge from his cabin, not with anger, but with a look of cold, disappointed authority. Arthur couldn't hear the words, but he saw the girl collapse to her knees. He saw the rest of the family emerge and form a silent, watching circle. There was no compassion in their faces, only a kind of grim, ritualistic resignation. The scene was utterly devoid of the warmth or chaos of a normal family dispute. It was cold, orderly, and terrifying. Arthur, a man of rational thought, felt a primal fear he couldn't explain. He knew, instinctively, that he had seen something he was never meant to see. A secret ceremony of fear. He backed away slowly, his heart pounding. The image of the crying girl burned into his mind. He was no longer just a botanist, he was a witness. And in that moment, he became the single greatest threat to Silas's hidden kingdom. Arthur Vance retreated from the swamp a changed man. The scientific detachment he had prided himself on was shattered, replaced by a haunting, obsessive need to understand what he had seen. For days, he was paralyzed by fear and confusion. He replayed the scene over and over in his mind. The girl's silent tears, the cold authority of the old man, the chillingly passive circle of onlookers. It felt like something out of a Gothic novel, not rural Florida. Sleep offered no escape. His dreams were filled with images of weeping faces and menacing, shadowy figures in the swamp. Finally, mustering his courage, he did what any logical person would do. He rode to the nearest town with a sheriff's office, a dusty settlement called Oakhaven. There, he tried to explain his story to Sheriff Brody, a world-weary man who had seen his share of strange frontier behavior. Let's be real, you can imagine how this went. Arthur, an educated, agitated outsider, breathlessly describing a ritualistic scene of emotional abuse in a family known only for being intensely private and religious. The sheriff listened, chewing on a piece of straw, his expression a mixture of pity and suspicion. He knew of the family. The Silas clan, he'd say. Odd folk, keep to themselves, deeply devout. You sure you didn't just stumble on a family prayer meeting, son? Sometimes their ways can seem strange to us outsiders. Arthur insisted, his voice rising with frustration, but his story was too vague, too surreal. He had no proof, only a feeling. He was dismissed as a spooked academic, his imagination likely amplified by the disorienting nature of the swamp. He left the sheriff's office not with a posse, but with a condescending pat on the back and the deep, chilling realization that he was utterly, terrifyingly alone with this knowledge. Despite his initial dismissal, Arthur's frantic testimony planted a tiny seed of doubt in Sheriff Brody's mind. He had a duty to at least appear to investigate. So a few days later, Brody made the long ride out to the Silas homestead. This wasn't a raid, it was a casual visit. He was met at the edge of the property by Caleb, who was polite but firm, and then by Silas himself. Now, you have to understand the power of Silas's charisma when deployed defensively. He welcomed the sheriff not as an intruder, but as a lost lamb. He offered him water, spoke calmly about the hardships of their life, and framed their isolation as a holy mission. When Brody cautiously brought up the incident reported by the young botanist, Silas smiled a sad, knowing smile. He explained that the young woman Arthur had seen, his own granddaughter, was prone to spiritual fits. He said they had been praying for her, trying to calm a soul tormented by visions she was too young to understand. He even called the girl, Elara, to speak with the sheriff. She appeared, her eyes downcast, and in a quiet, rehearsed monotone she confirmed her grandfather's story. She spoke of her troubled spirit and her gratitude for her family's prayers. There were no visible marks on her, no sign of distress, only a profound, unnerving emptiness. Brody was out of his depth. He was a lawman, used to dealing with drunks and cattle rustlers, not complex spiritual manipulation. Faced with a united family, a plausible, if strange, explanation, and a victim who denied any wrongdoing, what could he do? He had no warrant, no evidence, and no legal grounds to push further. He left the homestead convinced that Arthur Vance was simply a well-meaning but hysterical city boy. The family's wall of plausible deniability had held perfectly. The inquiry was officially closed. While Sheriff Brody saw no legal proof of a crime, the evidence was, in fact, all around him. It was walking, breathing, and etched into the very DNA of the people he had just met. He might have dismissed the downcast eyes and submissive postures as signs of piety, but they were the hallmarks of long-term psychological conditioning. The true, undeniable evidence was in the younger generation. Had he looked closer, he might have noticed that many of the children had the same subtle, yet distinct physical markers: the slightly too wide-set eyes, the low-set ears, the distinctive shape of the jawline. These are the quiet signatures of recessive genes meeting each other far too often. He might have seen teenagers who looked frail and sickly, their bodies lacking the vigor of youth, a direct result of compromised immune systems. This is the tragic living ledger of inbreeding. I want you to picture this. Ilara, the girl Arthur saw. Her outward compliance was a survival mechanism, but her inner world was likely a landscape of confusion and terror. And what about the children Silas deemed holy innocents? These children, kept out of sight during the sheriff's visit, were the most damning evidence of all. Their physical and cognitive disabilities were a direct biological indictment of Silas's entire philosophy. They were the product of his pure bloodline, and their suffering was the interest paid on his genetic debt. But because this evidence was biological, not criminal in a way the sheriff understood, it remained invisible to him. The victims themselves were the exhibits in a trial that was never held, their altered bodies the silent testimony in a case that was dismissed before it could even be opened. Their very existence was the truth, but it was a truth written in a language the outside world was not yet equipped to read. The true horror of Silas's project wasn't just its brutal outcome, it was its cold, deliberate methodology. This was not merely the ranting of a religious fanatic. This was a chillingly systematic process, a grotesque parody of science and animal husbandry applied to human beings. Had Arthur Vance been able to study the ledgers in the genealogy room, he would have found the intellectual engine of this nightmare. This is where the story gets truly chilling. Silas had developed what he called his purity calculus, a horrifying arithmetic of human worth. He didn't use complex formulas, but a system of points, like a shopkeeper balancing his books. For each family member of marrying age, he created a profile in his ledger. He would assign them numerical scores in different categories. There was a score for fidelity, measuring their unquestioning obedience to his doctrine. There was a score for generational proximity, tracking how closely their blood was tied to his own. And there was a score for physical form, judging their strength, health, and appearance against his ideal. But he also used negative scores. He would subtract points for what he chillingly termed deviations. This could be anything from a questioning attitude, which was a major demerit, to a slight physical imperfection like a limp or a facial mole. When it came time to plan a new union, Silas would sit with his ledgers, literally adding and subtracting the scores of potential partners. He was trying to engineer the perfect offspring, to balance the equation by pairing a man with a high fidelity score, for example, with a woman whose high generational proximity score would offset her minor deviation. It was a monstrous, dispassionate process that stripped away love, attraction, and humanity, reducing his own family to a collection of traits to be managed and manipulated in his ghastly experiment. Every story of profound darkness needs a hero, a force of opposition. And in this narrative, the hero wasn't a knight in shining armor. It was Arthur Vance, the mild-mannered botanist. After his dismissal by the sheriff, something within him broke. His scientific curiosity, once directed at orchids, was now aimed squarely at the Silas clan. He was consumed by it. He wasn't a natural hero. He was a quiet, academic man, more comfortable with Latin names for plants than with confrontation. But the image of that crying girl, Elara, had become his moral compass. He knew he couldn't let it go. This is where his character becomes so compelling. He was flawed. He was terrified. He spent weeks wrestling with his conscience, knowing that to pursue this meant abandoning his career, his safety, and his sanity. Let's be real, most people would have walked away. They would have told themselves they did all they could. But Arthur was cursed with an unshakable integrity. His personal stake was not one of blood or relation, but of shared humanity. He felt a profound intellectual and moral offense at what he suspected was happening, the perversion of natural order, the systematic crushing of the human spirit. He realized the law was a dead end. The sheriff wouldn't act without proof, and the only way to get proof was to go back into the swamp that now felt like the gaping maw of some great beast. His mission was no longer about orchids. It was about rescuing not just a single girl, but an entire family from a prison they didn't even know they were in. He was an ordinary man who, when faced with extraordinary evil, found he could not look away, and that decision would change his life, and theirs forever. Arthur knew that charging back in would be suicide. He needed a new approach, a way to get inside the family's world without raising suspicion. His plan was born of his own background. He would use his knowledge of the swamp to make himself useful. He spent a week meticulously mapping the area, identifying sources of clean water, patches of edible plants, and areas rich with game that the family might not have known about. He then approached the homestead again, not with accusations, but with an offering. He presented himself to Caleb as a simple traveler, a naturalist who had lost his funding and was living off the land. He offered to share his knowledge of the swamp's resources in exchange for a little food and a safe place to camp nearby. It was a huge risk, but it worked. Caleb, ever pragmatic, saw the value in Arthur's expertise. Silas, ever arrogant, likely saw Arthur as a harmless, godless man whom he could easily manipulate or even convert. They allowed him to stay on the periphery, a cautious truce established. I want you to picture the tension of Arthur's new life. He spent his days guiding the younger sons to hidden hunting spots, all the while observing, listening, and carefully documenting everything in a coded journal. He learned the family's routines, the subtle signals of fear and authority, the names of the children who were kept hidden. He would engage Silas in cautious theological debates, feigning interest to understand the warped logic that underpinned their world. Every moment was a performance. Every conversation was a tightrope walk over a chasm of suspicion. He was an investigator deep behind enemy lines, gathering intelligence one quiet, terrifying day at a time, waiting for the one opportunity to find the proof he so desperately needed. We've reached a critical point in our investigation. Arthur is inside. He's breathing the same air as the monster he's hunting, walking the same ground as the victims he's desperate to save. The tension is becoming unbearable. Every rustle of leaves, every sideways glance from Silas could mean his discovery and his death. From here on out, the story accelerates and the stakes are raised to a level that is almost unimaginable. Can you handle what comes next? Because this is where the story turns truly chilling. We are about to go with Arthur into the heart of the beast, into the one place he's forbidden to go. What he finds there will be worse than anything he could have possibly imagined. So take a breath, steel yourself. The slow burn is over. The fire is about to begin. Arthur knew the key to everything was the genealogy room. He had heard the children whisper about it in hushed, fearful tones. It was Silas's holy of holies, and it was always locked. His chance came during a fierce, unseasonal thunderstorm, the kind that turns the Florida sky black and sends torrential rain hammering down on the tin roofs. The storm was a perfect cover. The noise would mask his movements, and the family, including the ever-watchful Silas and Caleb, would be securing the homestead against the deluge. Under the cloak of the storm's fury, Arthur picked the simple lock on Silas's cabin door. The air inside was stale, smelling of old paper and something else. An antiseptic, medicinal smell that made his skin crawl. He found the door to the genealogy room and slipped inside. What he saw made the blood freeze in his veins. The walls were covered in horrifyingly meticulous charts, but it was the ledgers on the desk that were the true abomination. He flipped through the pages, his hands shaking. He saw the purity calculus, the cold equations that decided human fates. But then he found the final ledger. This one wasn't about pairings, it was about outcomes. It was a log of every child born in the community for the last 30 years. Next to each name were cold clinical notes. Healthy male, high F, G. Female, minor D, cleft lip. But then he saw the entries that made him gasp. Failure, stillborn. Failure, infant death, lung weakness. And the most horrifying of all, next to several names, failure, dispatched. Dispatched. The word was clinical, clean, and utterly monstrous. It was undeniable proof of infanticide. This wasn't just about inbreeding, it was about culling the imperfect results. He knew he had found it, the undeniable damning evidence. He grabbed the final ledger, wrapped it in oilcloth, and knew he had to run. Now. The room seemed to close in around him, the air growing heavier with each breath. The charts on the walls, with their spidery lines connecting names and dates, loomed like a web spun by some malevolent intelligence. Arthur's heart pounded as he tucked the ledger under his coat, its weight both a burden and a talisman. He glanced at the door, half expecting Silas's shadow to fill the frame, his cold eyes glinting with suspicion. The storm outside roared louder, a crack of lightning illuminating the room in stark white, casting jagged shadows across the charts. Each name in the ledger burned in his mind, children who had never had a chance, judged by a twisted logic that deemed them unworthy. He moved toward the door, but a faint sound stopped him, a soft creak from the floorboards beyond the room. His pulse surged. Was it the storm, or had someone returned? The antiseptic smell grew sharper, almost suffocating, mingling with the damp rot of the cabin's old wood. Arthur clutched the ledger tighter, his fingers tracing the oilcloth's slick surface. He thought of the children's whispers, their fear of Silas's judgments, and realized they had known, in their own way, the horrors hidden here. The ledger's final pages had listed dates as recent as last month, and one entry, a girl, failure, dispatched, bore a name he recognized from a cradle he'd seen in the communal hall, now empty. The creak came again, closer. Arthur's eyes darted to a small window, its glass rattling under the storm's assault. He had no time to hesitate. He shoved the ledger deeper into his coat and slipped out of the room, the charts seeming to watch him go. The cabin door was still ajar, rain sluicing through the gap, and he stepped into the deluge, the ledger's terrible secrets pressed against his chest. The storm swallowed his footsteps as he ran, but he felt the weight of unseen eyes on his back, as if the homestead itself knew he had stolen its darkest truth. He had to get to town, to someone who could stop this, before Silas realized the ledger was gone. Clutching the ledger, Arthur scrambled out of the cabin just as the storm began to break. A flash of lightning illuminated the compound, and in that split second, he saw the main cabin door open. It was Silas. Their eyes met across the muddy yard. There was no shock on Silas's face, only a look of cold reptilian fury. The hunt was on. Arthur didn't run for the road. He knew Caleb would be faster. He plunged into the swamp, his only ally the darkness and his intricate knowledge of the terrain. This wasn't a chase with shouting and gunfire. It was a silent, terrifying pursuit. His pursuers were Caleb and two of the older sons, men who had grown up in this swamp, who could move through it as silently as shadows. The sheer terror of it gripped Arthur, crashing through the undergrowth, his heart hammering against his ribs, the precious ledger held tight to his chest. Behind him, not the sound of footsteps, but the unnatural quiet that meant he was being stalked. He could feel their presence. He used every trick he knew, wading through black water to hide his trail, scrambling up trees to break the scent, doubling back on his own tracks. For hours, it was a desperate game of cat and mouse in the pitch-black labyrinth of the swamp. He could hear a twig snap to his left, the low call of a nightbird to his right. A signal. They were flanking him, herding him. He was exhausted, terrified, and close to despair. In a final desperate gambit, he plunged into a deep, algae-choked waterway he had mapped weeks before, one that led to an underwater passage, hoping the black water would finally swallow his trail for good. He held his breath and submerged himself, praying they would pass him by. The water was frigid, its slimy tendrils coiling around his limbs as he sank into the murk. The ledger, wrapped in oilcloth, pressed against his chest like a second heart, its weight both a feline and a chain. Above, the swamp was silent, save for the fading patter of rain and the occasional rustle of leaves. But Arthur knew better than to trust the quiet. Caleb and the others were out there, their eyes honed by years of navigating this treacherous mire. His lungs burned, begging for air, but he forced himself to stay under, gliding through the narrow underwater passage, his fingers brushing against roots and unseen things that slithered away. The darkness was absolute, pressing against his eyes, amplifying every sound, the muffled thud of his own heartbeat, the distant splash of something moving above. He surfaced at last in a shallow pool, gasping softly, his ears straining for any sign of pursuit. The swamp was still, but it felt alive, watchful, as if it were complicit in Silas's hunt. A faint ripple broke the water's surface nearby, and Arthur froze, his hand tightening on the ledger. Had they found him? He scanned the shadows, the gnarled cypress trees looming like sentinels. Then, a low whistle, sharp, deliberate, cut through the air, too close. They were still tracking him, their movements eerily precise, as if they could sense his fear through the damp air. Arthur's legs trembled, his strength waning, but the thought of those ledger entries, failure, dispatched, spurred him on. He waded forward, keeping low, the water lapping at his waist. The swamp seemed to shift around him, its paths twisting, as if conspiring to trap him. Yet he pressed on, driven by the need to expose the horrors he carried, knowing that if he faltered, the swamp and Silas would claim him as they had so many others. Gasping, covered in mud and leeches, Arthur emerged from the waterway miles from the homestead. He had escaped. He stumbled through the pre-dawn gloom for what felt like an eternity until he finally collapsed on the outskirts of Oakhaven. He was a terrifying sight. A wild-eyed man in torn clothes clutching a muddy book. He staggered directly to the sheriff's office, bypassing any other help. He threw the soaked, grimy ledger onto Sheriff Brody's desk. "There," he gasped. "There's your proof." At first, Brody was skeptical, recoiling from the crazed man before him. But as he carefully dried and opened the ledger, his demeanor changed. The neat, spidery script, the cold, clinical language, the lists of names, and those final, damning entries. Dispatched. The word hung in the air of the small office. This wasn't a story from a hysterical academic anymore. This was a record of systematic murder written in the killer's own hand. The reversal was immediate and absolute. The sheriff's face hardened. He looked at Arthur, no longer with pity, but with a newfound, grim respect. He deputized 2 men on the spot and sent a rider to the next county for reinforcements. The wall of plausible deniability that Silas had so carefully constructed had just been smashed to pieces by one waterlogged book and the insane courage of a man who refused to look away. The law, which had been so blind and impotent before, was finally coming for the Silas clan, and it was coming with force. The office, lit by a single flickering lamp, seemed to shrink under the weight of the ledger's revelations. Brody's fingers trembled slightly as he turned the pages, each one a testament to horrors hidden in plain sight. The names, children, infants, judged and discarded, seemed to pulse with a silent accusation. Arthur, still shivering from the swamp's chill, leaned against the wall, his breath ragged but his resolve unbroken. Outside, the first light of dawn crept over Oakhaven, casting long shadows through the dusty windows. The townsfolk, unaware of the storm brewing, went about their morning routines. But in that cramped office, a reckoning was taking shape. Brody's deputy, a wiry man named Hollis, peered over his shoulder, his face paling as he read. "My God," he muttered, the words barely audible. The ledger's entries were not just records. They were a map of depravity, charting a lineage of cruelty that had festered unchecked for decades. Brody snapped the book shut, the sound sharp in the quiet room. He didn't need to read further. "You're sure this came from Silas's cabin?" he asked, his voice low, as if afraid the walls might carry the question back to the homestead. Arthur nodded, his eyes burning with exhaustion and defiance. "I saw the charts too, the walls. They're covered in them. It's all there." Brody didn't hesitate now. He barked orders to Hollis, who grabbed a rifle from the rack, his hands steady despite the horror in his eyes. The rider sent for reinforcements was already galloping down the dirt road, dust trailing in his wake. Arthur sank into a chair, the ledger's weight no longer his alone to bear, but the memory of the swamp's silent pursuit clung to him. He could still feel Silas's reptilian gaze, the sense of being hunted through the mire. The law was moving, but Arthur knew Silas wouldn't surrender easily. The clan's secrets were out, but the man who'd written dispatched in that meticulous script was still out there, and Arthur couldn't shake the feeling that the swamp itself might rise to protect him. The raid on the Silas homestead was swift and overwhelming. At dawn, Sheriff Brody, backed by a dozen armed men, descended on the compound. There was no resistance. The family, caught completely by surprise, seemed to crumble without Silas's immediate direction. He and Caleb were apprehended immediately, their faces masks of cold disbelief. As the lawmen began to search the cabins, the true gut-wrenching scope of the horror was laid bare. It wasn't just the genealogy room, which was chilling enough. It was the discovery of what they called the quiet room at the back of the property. Here, they found two of the imperfect children, a boy and a girl, both teenagers but with the physical and mental development of toddlers. They were emaciated, living in squalor, hidden away from the world. It was a sight that brought even the most hardened deputies to tears. They found small, unmarked graves behind the compound, shallow pits in the soft earth. The official reason for these graves would have been stillbirths or infant fevers, but with the ledger as a guide, they knew they were looking at the final resting places of the dispatched. Every part of the homestead, which had once seemed so rustic and pious, now looked sinister. The communal dining hall felt like a mess hall in a prison. The simple cabins felt like cells. The lawmen uncovered caches of herbs known to induce miscarriage, confirming another layer of Silas's horrifying control over the women's bodies. It was a chamber of horrors disguised as a farm, a concentration camp masquerading as a community of faith. The men who conducted the raid would be haunted by what they saw there for the rest of their lives. With Silas and Caleb in custody, the process of unmasking them began. Stripped of his authority and his swamp fortress, Silas was no longer a prophet. He was just a frail, bitter old man. His past was unearthed piece by piece. It was discovered that he had been driven out of two other communities in Georgia and Alabama decades earlier for his unorthodox teachings and unseemly interest in the lineage of his followers. He wasn't a man who had found God in the Florida swamp. He was a predator who had finally found the perfect, isolated hunting ground to enact his lifelong obsession. His charisma was revealed for what it was, the classic tool of a narcissistic sociopath, a mask to hide a profound emptiness and a bottomless need for control. Caleb, away from his father, proved to be a broken man. His testimony was a confused, rambling mix of fear, loyalty, and flickers of resentment. He confessed to his role in enforcing his father's rules, even admitting to assisting in the deaths of two infants he was told were too weak to bear the family's spiritual light. His villainy was not born of grand vision, but of pathetic, desperate subservience. And what of Martha, the matriarch? She retreated into a near catatonic state, refusing to speak, her silence a final impenetrable shield. The unmasking revealed a trinity of evil. Silas, the architect of the ideology, Caleb, the brutal enforcer, and Martha, the silent, complicit partner who allowed it all to happen. The community saw them not as gods or leaders, but as the architects of their own misery. As investigators painstakingly deciphered Silas's journals and correspondence, a far more disturbing picture began to emerge. The crime wasn't entirely contained within the Florida swamp. Silas, it turned out, was not a complete original. He was an avid reader of the burgeoning and deeply dangerous literature of eugenics. He had been corresponding for years with a small, scattered network of like-minded individuals across the United States and even one man in Germany. These weren't grand conspiracies discussed in smoke-filled rooms. They were letters exchanged between isolated fanatics, sharing their own twisted theories on blood purity, racial hygiene, and the creation of a master human stock. Now you have to understand the context of the time. This was the era of Francis Galton, when eugenics was starting to be discussed in some academic circles as a legitimate science. Silas was a crude, backwoods practitioner of an idea that was gaining a terrifying intellectual foothold in the wider world. His letters revealed that he saw his family not just as a holy project, but as a scientific one. He was trying to create a pure American bloodline, resistant to the diseases and moral decay he saw in the outside world. He was, in his own mind, a pioneer. This discovery was profoundly shocking. It elevated the case from a local horror story to a terrifying example of how dangerous pseudo-scientific ideas could filter down and mutate into monstrous real-world applications. Silas wasn't just an isolated madman. He was a symptom of a much larger, more insidious intellectual disease that was slowly poisoning parts of Western thought. The international network was small and informal, but its existence proved that the darkness in that swamp had roots that reached far beyond its borders. Once the initial shock of the raid wore off, a difficult question began to surface. How did this happen? How did an entire community function as a death cult for decades without anyone stopping it? The answer depressingly lies in a societal conspiracy of silence. This wasn't a formal, planned conspiracy, but a de facto one born of fear, indifference, and a deeply ingrained reluctance to interfere. Neighboring communities had heard rumors for years. They called the Silas clan swamp folk, or the ghost family. They noted the strange lack of new faces, the way the family members would turn away and refuse to make eye contact in town, but no one acted. Why? Fear was a major factor. The family was intimidating, and the swamp was a place where people could and did disappear. But there was also the powerful American ideal of privacy and property. A man's home was his castle, and his family was his business. To interfere was to overstep a serious social boundary. There was also a subtle class and education bias at play. The authorities and more civilized townspeople likely looked down on the Silas clan as uneducated religious zealots. Their strange ways were dismissed as the product of ignorance, not malice. Let's be real, it was easier to mock them than to seriously investigate them. This collective shoulder shrug, this societal agreement to look the other way, created the perfect environment for Silas to operate without fear of reprisal. The silence wasn't just a lack of noise, it was a form of passive permission. It was a deep, societal failure to protect the most vulnerable, a failure for which everyone in the surrounding area bore a small but undeniable piece of the blame. In the end, the wheels of justice, once they finally started turning, moved with grim purpose. Silas, defiant to the last, was put on trial. His defense was a rambling, incoherent mess of scripture and pseudo-scientific theory, which only served to convince the jury of his insanity and his guilt. He was convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to hang, though he would ultimately die of a stroke in his cell before the sentence could be carried out. A quiet end for a man who had wrought so much havoc. Caleb, in exchange for his full confession and testimony against his father, received a lesser sentence of life in prison. He would spend the next 40 years in a state penitentiary, a broken and forgotten man, haunted by the ghosts of the relatives he had helped to condemn. Martha was declared mentally unfit to stand trial and was committed to a state asylum where she lived out the rest of her days in near total silence. And our hero, Arthur Vance? He became something of a local celebrity, but the fame was unwelcome. The experience had scarred him deeply. He abandoned his career in botany, unable to find peace in the quiet observation of nature anymore. He moved away from Florida, seeking anonymity, and lived a quiet, solitary life, forever marked by his time in the swamp. The surviving members of the family were the most tragic figures. They were wards of the state, struggling to adapt to a world they had been taught to fear. Some managed to build new lives, but many carried the physical and psychological scars of their upbringing forever, lost souls caught between the monstrous world they had escaped and a new one that they could never fully understand. So what is the legacy of this horrifying chapter of history? What do we take away from the ashes of the Silas family? On the surface, it's a cautionary tale about a single, monstrous man. But the true moral of this story is far deeper and more unsettling. It's a lesson about the terrifying power of ideology. It shows how any idea, even one with noble intentions like faith or purity, can be twisted into a weapon of absolute control and unimaginable cruelty. It reveals the terrifying vulnerability of the isolated human mind and the ease with which a charismatic leader can replace reason with dogma. This story is a stark reminder that evil isn't always loud and explosive. Sometimes it is quiet, methodical, and patient. It can wear the mask of piety, the robes of science, or the smile of a loving grandfather. The legacy is also in the silence that surrounded it. It forces us to ask ourselves uncomfortable questions about our own responsibility. When do we speak up? When do we cross the line from respecting privacy to enabling abuse? It shows that the fence between a community and a cult is terrifyingly thin, and that the sentries guarding that fence are ordinary people like you and me. The ultimate lesson, the one that should chill us to the bone, is that the conditions that created the Silas family, isolation, fear, economic hardship, and the appeal of simple answers to complex problems, have not vanished from the world. The swamp may have been drained, but the darkness that festered there is a perennial part of the human condition. We've walked through the ashes of this family's history, but the chilling questions they raise linger in the present. Could a monster like Silas thrive today? In an age of online echo chambers and digital cults, have the swamps merely been replaced by screens? It's a haunting thought that the tools of isolation and control have only evolved. What do you think? Could you spot the warning signs of a modern-day Silas before it was too late? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. This conversation is how we keep these shadows from taking root again. If this investigation has left its mark on you, please subscribe to Shadow Stories and share this journey with others who dare to look into the dark. Our work here is a reminder that we must remain vigilant.